ounces stronger than I am. Yesterday I moved a mountain. I bet I could be your hero. I am a mighty little man. I am a mighty little man. Our whole universe was in a hot, dense state. Then nearly 14 billion years ago, expansion started. Wait, the earth began to cool, the autotrophs began to drool, Neanderthals developed tools, we built the wall, we built the pyramids, math, science, history, unraveling the mystery. It all started with the Big Bang. Well, hello, this is Jason Ingram, also known as Fake Zappa. I'm a multimedia artist and mental health activist, and I've been doing a series now since Young Sheldon came out about Sheldon Cooper and about how mental illness is portrayed in the media. And I use this character in particular simply because, like Adrian Monk and a few other characters that are on sitcoms and regular network television shows, most of the time the mentally ill person is the antagonist or the villain, typically, although it seems like the Adrian Monk character and the Sheldon Cooper character have a tendency to annoy and antagonize people. However, I choose these characters because of their sincerity. And that's a thing that I think comes out in some of these shows that, yeah, they're tedious and at the same time they're sincere. So if they come off as being self-centered and all this kind of stuff, just know that they never develop that part. But other than that, they do care about people. They just have a hard time showing it. So this is a special extended edition here. I will do some more of my fun with Fag Flags, which I did in some of my earlier episodes when Young Sheldon first started. A little bit of music and some really depressing stuff. So I have a hot beverage here for you just in case I get you a little too sad. All right, so now I'm going to show you something in one of my favorite episodes of The Big Bang Theory here. And this is just part of the Sheldon Cooper quirks here. For instance, the seat is ideally located both in relation to the heat source in the winter and the cross breeze in the summer. It also faces the television at a direct angle, also allowing me to immerse myself in entertainment or gameplay without being subject to conversation. As a result, I've placed it in a state of eternal dibs. Okay, but that's not the one I wanted to get at here. Let's see, where is it? Oh yeah, this is when you're applying to be a roommate for Sheldon Cooper. I think as far as I remember correctly, he also said whistlers need not to apply. I couldn't quite find that quote, but I did find this one. He says, "What is the sixth noble gas?" Well, you said you're a scientist. What is the sixth noble gas? And Leonard's like, radon? He says, "Is that a question?" No, radon. And then next question, Kirk or Picard? Well, that's tricky. Original series over Next Generation, but Picard over Kirk. And he said, you passed the first barrier to roommatehood. So here's what I want to get at is, for instance, one of the episodes of Sheldon Cooper and mental illness portrayed in the media had to do with what if he wasn't gifted? What if he was just mentally ill and had nothing really, quote, special, end quote, to contribute to society, like Adrian Monk, and Rain Man and some of these other ones too. And, there's a couple of real life stories out there, like, of course, Patty Duke had a lot to contribute, especially one of my favorite folks, Brian Wilson. And then you have a lot of tragic tales, in England, they do a really good job fucking with their mentally ill artists. They're really bad. Although America, we sure have our casualties as well. But Nick Drake is one in particular, and of course Brian Wilson. So if you want a really good realistic story that's similar to a lot of the stuff that I went through, except for he was a public figure and I wasn't. And there's a DVD done about 5-10 years ago called Love and Mercy, and the book as well. It's just that the stories we don't hear about are those that suffer alone. And so I'm going to talk about being invisible today, and that's why I need to pour you a hot beverage. There you go. So, the reality of the mentally ill, and this has really been my case. Now, I don't suffer with Asperger's like the character Sheldon Cooper does, and I've met a few Aspies, and I'm curious about a few that might be on that spectrum. Jeopardy James Holzhauer. I kind of wonder because it's like he's trying to make his face do things. As if he has to tell his facial expressions what to do, which is a common thing that folks with Asperger's typically suffer with. It's like, okay, there's this emotion, I have to actually make effort to express that emotion. Now that's sometimes with me, because I can come off as very insincere a lot. And also, when it comes to developmental disorders, I've never been diagnosed with a developmental disorder, although socially I'm very undeveloped and there's certain things that just never will, especially because of my environment. Now, part of that also has to do with being in an environment where I was basically had a lot of opportunities to be treated like I was invisible. And that's especially hard when I'm around places where I feel like I can contribute. Now, luckily, I was with a bunch of like hyper-educated, cultured, world traveler type progressive people. So I was exposed to a lot of things. What I like about the Sheldon Cooper character is that there's a lot of reality in a lot of gifted people who were raised in like rural areas like East Texas. And I happen to be between Houston and Dallas right now. So that's what's cool about this, is the Texas edition of Sheldon Cooper and mental illness. And that's why I did some banjo stuff. And of course, with my queer perspective, and of course I've got to talk about Lance Barber. And in addition to that, I wanted to do something that's very serious. Some of my other things I've talked about in this series were, for instance, abuse. That a lot of us are vulnerable to abuse, and one of the reasons why we're vulnerable is that a lot of people don't see us that way, especially if we're seen as predators. And it's really hard to have compassion on somebody when you're scared of them. And it's really hard not to be scared of them when certain people are portrayed certain ways, especially mood disorders. It seems like there's a certain innocence about developmental disorders. That's kind of a no-brainer. And they have a whole different set of things that they suffer with as far as in social situations, and of course being treated like they're stupid all the time because they don't pick up on obvious things. And that's been my thing too, not having an obvious form of cognitive or neurological developmental issues. I definitely misunderstand very obvious things that are going on in the room because my mind is listening to the music and I'm analyzing it and I'm picking it apart. Or I can't hear what they're saying in the movies because I'm more interested in the cinematography or something and trying to figure out, how this was shot, because I'm really nerdy when it comes to that kind of stuff, which is why I turned my travel trailer into a cheap studio with a cheap piece of background and cheap lighting equipment. But as far as that is, I definitely know what it's like to be in a room full of people who are hyper-social, high social functioning, high business functioning, and of course high cognitive functioning and things like that. I also know what it's like to have a sister who's close in age, not my twin, but we were a grade apart, who is super hyper functioning and hyper social functioning. She always knew what was going on with our parents, who were just seemed to be clueless a lot of times about how they were even feeling. So it was amazing to have a sister like that who kind of reminded me of Missy. So I just got to let's see, episode 5 in season 4, and it's amazing that they were able to produce this season during the pandemic, so they had to get real creative. I think that's why we're only at episode 6 so far, and the first episode about him graduating was really touching. In fact, I got all teary-eyed, and right when I started getting teary-eyed, I started laughing. So I could say Young Sheldon is not, the show where you laugh, you cry. In my case, I cry and then I laugh. So I really can relate to not being able to make friends with folks my age. And the weird thing is, and I'm open to dating guys my age. I can't think of a guy I've ever really dated my age or that I really felt like he was my equal. And so anyways, that's something I can relate to. But something you really don't see, of course, in the media is because once something is portrayed in the media, it's no longer invisible. So it'd be great if they had a story that they could tell of somebody who was invisible and who remained invisible for the entire show or the entire movie or whatever it is, or a documentary about somebody who was anonymous. Actually, a good example would be a documentary called Alien Boy. In fact, I rented that from the library 4 years ago when I was really trying to get out of a severe crisis. And I happened to rent it at the same time I rented Love and Mercy, the Brian Wilson story. And I'm like, holy shit, I watched this story about an artist who was kept invisible, and they just put him away in a special home, and he would wander around downtown, and he got beat up by the police and died as a result. And now, an update with that, though, I've actually had a dialogue for about the last year or so with the officer who was blamed killing James Chassie. So I watched that movie and I thought, oh my God, this guy is, 10 years older than me. This thing happened 10 years ago. So I was about the age of when he died. I think it was like 44. And he went to the same school that I went to and was kind of recognized in a hobbyist kind of a sense of being like a really talented hobbyist. Oh no, we can't allow him to have a career. That'll have ramifications that powerful people can't necessarily handle. They're usually incapable of that, and that's what I'm dealing with in my own life. There are reasons why powerful people keep some people invisible for reasons that I don't want to get to at this point. So, what is it to be invisible? Well, I watched the story about James Chassie, and he was giving of his art and things like that, and then he could have never had a career unless somebody was really willing to accommodate his needs and take a risk. Now, of course, with Brian Wilson, he didn't really get visibly symptomatic until the mid-60s, and by then he was world famous. I mean, that's about the time he's writing a song that the Beatles said was the best song was ever written, and the Beatles were writing some of the best songs at that point. So Brian Wilson was pretty fucking amazing, and he was so ill at that point. By 1966, ironically, the Beatles stopped playing live around there too. But anyways, Wilson stopped playing live because he was really sick, and about all he could do was studio stuff. And he created what I consider his masterpiece, and in my opinion, his only masterpiece, called Pet Sounds. And I thought, okay, what's the difference between these two movies? They were both vulnerable. They both suffered a lot of abuse from people who took advantage of them. And they're both tragic stories, but one ended horribly and one ended well. And if it wasn't for a gal named Melinda Ledbetter, who would have known what had happened to Brian Wilson? He would have probably ended up like Sid Barrett. And, which is really weird. I just got a text back, a very sad text. Somebody who, well, I don't want to get into it, but it had to do very, very connectively with Syd Barrett. I'll tell you that. There's a story in the works there, maybe, and I won't get into that. But I will say, though, that the difference between James Chassie of Portland, Oregon, also known as Jim Jim, the artist, who was born, I think, 1964, and Brian Wilson, was the fact that one was invisible, the other one was highly visible. And that is a sad reality for a lot of people, that we won't give them visibility until after they die. And I think Van Gogh is an example of that. And so a lot of times powerful people will not give anybody visibility until they die, or until they can be used as some kind of mascot, they can be owned or whatever. And I see this with a lot of very, very low functioning people who are used like, this is my thing, who's I'm taking care of, and I'm this caregiver, and he's a concert pianist or something like that. I don't know if there's anything necessarily wrong with that, but I've dealt with some of that before, and I think it's a little creepy, because it's not very empowering to the artist. And at the same time, some folks need 24/7 care that are in that tier where their level of care demands that. So with me, with mood disorders, it's not so much like that, except for, there's a combination of, PTSD and panic attacks and just, my clusterfuck of what I have to live with. And folks with Asperger's might not necessarily deal with all of that other stuff as well. It's just that they might need to cope when it comes to letting people know in their environment that, hey, if I come off as not being emotional or not responding to you very well, let's talk about that. And that would be hard for them. And at the same time, for those that I know that suffer with those kinds of disorders, it doesn't seem as hard as mood disorders. People are really fucking scared of bipolar, especially guys like me who are living alone and that are a little more like hillbilly natured, so to speak, because of the news media and all the old white guys who are losing their minds and doing murder-suicides. Here's the thing, is the last one that happened was about a month ago. In fact, today, I'm shooting this on the 25th, I think, and there was a guy in an RV, and he was a little older than me, and he just obviously seemed like he was desperate to get famous. Really, he had not... I don't think he had anything to contribute, so except for some explosives or something like that. It's just that that's a reality for some guys. If they're ignored and ignored and ignored, and the more they're ignored, the less privileges and the less rights and the less choices they have. And so if that guy wasn't white, he would have been shot already. Buddy, don't do that. I've got a crazy cat today who I had to keep inside because there is a sewage spill within about 20 or 30 feet away from here. And the last time Buddy got into something like that, he got really, really sick. So he's been really cranky tonight. And he almost tipped the camera over, which wouldn't have been the first time you've done that. And look at his paws. Look at that. That's from this morning, and I've been trying to clean those paws off. And he really hates that, so I decided to let him do it. Ow! So leave my camera alone, okay, buddy? So, anyways, the reality of being invisible is a form of abuse that a lot of people... oh, shit. See? I told you he was going to do that. I do admire that cat's... he definitely is persistent. And speaking of having an inability to be ignored, see, there he goes. He's going to tip the camera over again. Speaking of an inability to be ignored, I can relate to that. Like my cat, he obviously wants to go outside, and I'm not going to let him because it's not safe out there tonight. So he's trying to get my attention. He's being all nice and cute. And then when that doesn't work, he's going to start being mean. And he knows the things I don't like, and he will do them over and over again until I give him what he wants or I lock him in the bathroom. That's very similar to people, especially men that get older, and it's really hard to deal with trauma when you're being ignored and you're in unsafe environments and nobody acknowledges it. It's very difficult to heal when you're constantly in unsafe environments, and it is a form of trauma. So a lot of times these men are getting re-traumatized over and over again just because of their environment. And so it's no wonder why a lot of these guys go from being, oh, he was so sincere and so lovable, to doing some kind of violent crime. And that's something I speak out about a lot. And being here in Central Texas, I can drive an hour this way and drive an hour that way and find an entirely different standard of mental health care that's available. We're talking about a couple weeks ago, a guy gets shot 3 times on his property because it was the wrong mental health care. And just an hour in this direction, you could apply for disability through an agency that'll handle all of your meds and your therapy and your groups and, you know, a caseworker and an attorney and all that kind of stuff at no charge. And so it's really hard to be in a county where you have to keep calling and calling and calling and you get nowhere. And I know because I was in another part of Texas a few months ago, and I decided I was going to follow up on some leads that were being promoted, and they went nowhere after several calls. Now, I'm used to that kind of bullshit. However, when you get a lot of guys that are suffering and they're alone, and there's so much stigma about that, is that it doesn't get any better. It just gets worse and worse. And when the mental health community and industry starts ignoring somebody, then of course they're going to avoid it. Not only that, though, we're talking about rural Americans. So that's a huge issue for me. So I get on my soapbox about that a whole bunch. So please drink some more of my hot. And now for the fake Zappa version of Fun with Flags. This is Fun with Fag Flags, a queer perspective and a mockery of Sheldon Cooper's Fun with Flags. And of course, you can't have a fag flag without the epic classic rainbow flag. And this one here, not so well known, is the leather pride flag, known black and blue with love. Sometimes also to be confused with the BDSM flag. And please don't ask me what that stands for. This one here is a very, very lesser known fag flag. And you will need to be accustomed to the music of Lady Gaga, the Born This Way flag, with the rainbow letters. This is and was the epic gay bear pride flag that, through lots of windstorms, ended up being lodged in this fence. So I did a couple of years ago display the bear pride flag in another episode of the mental illness with Sheldon Cooper. And of course, the ultimate gay pride flag coming to you from Central Texas is the Texan gay pride. And nothing speaks more Texan than the Lone Star rainbow itself. Well, I tried to buy a new camera the last time I was in town, and they were out of the camera that I wanted. and you can't buy a display model at certain stores because they're fakes. They're like dummies. So I'm coming to you from this really shitty camera thanks to Sony and $1,200 worth of 4K bullshit. I will continue and try to remember where I left off when the camera stopped somewhere in the middle of what I was talking about. So anyways, my cat, Buddy, he's 2 years old, and today in particular, he's not allowed to go outside because my neighbors accidentally spilled some raw sewage. And the last time he got into that, I had to make a couple of trips to the veterinarian, and I thought he was going to die because of how sick he got. So, anyways, he's really cranky because he wants to go outside, hang out with the neighbor cats or whatever. And I'm not going to let him, and so he's being all cute and nice, and then when that doesn't work, he hates being ignored, and he tries to get my attention, especially when I'm doing videos, and then he knows if he messes with my camera, that's about one of the worst things he could do, is start, typing on the computer and tipping over guitars, and, some of my biggest, lack of a better term, pet peeves. And it's interesting, though, this happens with not only pets, of course, children, though, when they're ignored, one of the reasons why they, quote, act out, end quote, is they are responding to a form of abuse that I call passive-aggressive abuse. And I was raised under a lot of that stuff, a lot of passive-aggressive behavior, to where I was treated as if I wasn't even there. I wasn't even in the room. Now, some parents really don't know how to handle a kid who is emotionally out of control, mentally out of control. Even folks with a mental health background, even folks with a mental health for children background can't handle a mentally ill kid. And they're either going to be aggressive or they're going to be passive. The thing about being passive is that nobody knows what's going on. They don't even know what's going on. The victim doesn't even know what's going on. However, what ends up happening is that kid goes from, okay, I tried being lovable, I tried giving, I tried offering the kind of compassion that I'm hoping to get back if I give that to you, because some kids end up having to be the shoulder to cry on for dysfunctional parents, which is, why you get some really interesting kids that grow up like that. So what happens is that if that doesn't work, then the child starts doing whatever they can to force their environment to notice them. And this is what happens with a lot of men, especially men my age and older, that are in RVs and alone. And of course, there's a lot of stigma with that, even with white guys, because in the news, it seems like I fit a lot of the demographic, especially with the trauma background, mood disorders, and all that kind of stuff, not having access to quality care and things like that. Of course, there's a lot of stigma to that because there's a lot of denial about that. And a lot of it just has to do with what country you're in, what county you're in. And here I am in central Texas, and I can drive an hour this way, an hour that way, and find dramatically different levels of care and the standards when it comes to mental health care. One place, you're acting out on your own property, and you get shot 3 times. Boom, right there. And that happened here just a few weeks ago. And then I talked to some of the locals, and they say, not even law enforcement, and they're trained in mental health. Even the mental health workers still trigger mentally ill people. And so that's a level of care they have in this direction. You go this direction almost an hour. And I was talking to a local who called a place, and they helped him get on disability, and they got him a caseworker, medications, therapy, I'm sure group stuff as well, and an attorney to help with and for free, for no charge. And I'm like, I'm jealous. I haven't had a caseworker in probably 25 years. and and that's one of the things I've been trying to do, to orchestrate me getting back to work, getting a legitimate amount of mental health care. And there's a whole bunch of denial because people think that it's available. And so I thought it'd be funny to travel the country and to think, well, if it's not available in like the liberal mecca of America, which is Portland, Oregon, what's it like in other places? And it's different everywhere I go, but most of the time it's extremely deficient. And if the people who get support are able to get enough care in environments where there's not good mental health care, they typically have a lot of privileges, and a lot of it is because they have some kind of community that is supportive. So one of the things that I have a hard time with, especially what's portrayed on the news. The news portrays mentally ill people like Adrian Monk and Sheldon Cooper, and you have a few other real life stories and things like that, as you know, like was it David Helfgott, the movie Shine. You know, there was a guy who got a lot of attention, and then like 20 years of no attention, and then another 20 years of a bunch of attention. Most of the time you're dealing with somebody, whether they're gifted or talented, or they have really nothing to offer but, you know, friendship. When somebody's alone, it's one thing. When somebody's alone and they're suffering and they don't get care, that's another thing. And at the same time, if somebody has something to contribute, like, hey, I want to give, I'm a concert pianist, or I'm a scientist, or whatever it is, and they're not allowed to, that makes things, that's a triple threat that is in the works of somebody who could be prone to violent crime. I think some of these guys that commit violent crime might have something that they want to contribute. I think a lot of it is just they're just tired of being ignored. They're tired of suffering in silence, and especially in a lot of areas where men are encouraged to get care, they're told to get care, and for whatever reason, it ends up being counterproductive, especially in rural settings, especially those with a conservative ideology. So when it comes to characters like Sheldon Cooper, I haven't seen anything in his life story except for maybe like even when he disappeared on that train trip, and there might be stories like between, well, actually, though, when he was living alone in his apartment, I think he was pretty invisible. So I think maybe there is some things in the Sheldon Cooper story where he had periods in his life where he was invisible. It's just that I would like to see more stories, especially real life stories, where they find people who are invisible, because that would make me be like, okay, I could relate to that. That's something that I could be like, we need to see that. And especially we need to see, because the mentally ill middle-aged man who's alone, who's got no friends, no family, no job, those are the kinds of folks who are synonymous with crazy harmful, like psychotic. And well, actually, psychotic isn't necessarily a harmful thing. I've dealt with psychosis, I've dealt with delusional stuff over the years, and I've never committed a violent crime in my life. It's just that there's certain things that we still need to change when it comes to how a lot of folks are portrayed in the media and stuff like that. The United States of Tara, I think, was a pretty darn good show. Dissociative identity disorder is one that, especially in the Hitchcock era, which was portrayed always as the horrible villain and stuff. And then movies like Sybil came along and stuff. It'd be really cool to have more shows and movies where they have a man who suffers with a dissociative identity disorder, because I have seen it in my life. And men can get very dangerous when they dissociate. They're capable of doing more harm. And at the same time, though, maybe statistically that might be true. It would be nice to have some more positive portrayals of men that really, really suffer, and they suffer in silence. a lot of times when a man deals with mental illness, he really tries hard to function. And all that stress and everything and trying to pretend and being in denial really messes with his head after a while. But I've found that if a mentally ill man gains a lot of power, a lot of recognition, he can in some ways kind of overcome or kind of white knuckle it for a long time until, and I hate to use this term, snaps, and suddenly he's violent. And a lot of times what happens is that he ends up in some kind of mental health crisis and nobody knows what's going on. In fact, he's buried it so deep in his consciousness, he doesn't even know what's going on, and he will find himself alone, and men cannot handle the loss of power. I know I hang out with a lot of retired guys. A lot of them have or develop a lot of mental health issues, especially these days. I think it's really funny to be filming a show about a germaphobe during a pandemic. I think that would have been interesting to be on set when they were filming a character like Sheldon Cooper. I kind of wonder if that actor has taken on some of those traits as well. I saw the actor on Jeopardy doing some of the clues, and he was brilliant. In fact, he acted a lot like Sheldon Cooper's character when he appeared on Jeopardy. So I thought that was really cool. So anyways, some of the things that I like to emphasize when it comes to mental illness is that in the media, they're doing better jobs at portraying them. It's just that the, quote, good guys that they show are always the ones who seem to have a strong community. Now, they're not always liked in that community. It's just that they're tolerated and they end up getting different forms of accommodations for whatever, like Adrian Monk's assistant always having a wipe, an antibacterial wipe every time he shakes somebody's hand, you know. I thought, man, I've never had anybody do anything close to that. Usually they just want to fix me, they want to cure me, they want to preach at me, they want to judge me, or they total denial of it, or they minimize it, they generalize it. I mean, I get this all the time because I meet people all the time. You know, I'm going from place to place. And so I'm finding I'm getting the same attitudes everywhere I go about mental illness, and I know the things that need to change. And a lot of things that need to change is what's portrayed on the media. Especially when they say, look, a disabled person. And I'm like, I have nothing in common with that person and that person and that person. When are they going to start showing the real stories of the things that I hear? Because the only people that can relate to me are the ones who aren't heard. And that's pretty darn sad. And so, anyways, howdy from Texas. I got this 10-gallon hat actually in Mexico, which I thought was really a trip. And I don't know how long I'm going to be staying in Texas, but I will say this, though, when it comes to fictional Texas towns, as much as I love Medford, Texas, and characters like Billy and Georgie and all these folks, I have to admit that the best Texas fictional town is Virgil, Texas, created by Talking Heads True Stories and the artist known as David Byrne. And that's where we first saw John Goodman on the big screen for most of us. And I love true stories. I love Texas, and I loathe Texas for some of the things that I've experienced here. They actually portray it pretty good in Young Sheldon, and especially rural Texans and stuff. And we've been in the news a lot lately. It's a very interesting state. And when it comes to mental health issues, there's a lot of crazy that goes on here too. And there's a lot of cameras, there's a lot of police, and there's a lot of fear. And I've seen that more than a lot of places that I've traveled here in the last 2 or 3 years and stuff. So anyways, one of the other things I like about Young Sheldon's story is his dad. I mean, his dad is portrayed as your typical asshole football coach. And at the same time, though, he's better than most dads that I know. And I was seeing an episode, I can't remember which season it was. I think it was a rerun from another season. But it was when they were going to California, and him and his dad hold hands, you know. And there's not a lot of kids that have a dad like that, no matter how much of a beer drinking creep he is. And at the same time, though, it is really hard to find parents who can handle a mentally ill kid. And that's typically the conversations are, is we're trying so hard, we're trying everything we can, we've done this and that and this and that. At the same time, it's like, yeah, but you're abusing that kid. I know, because I've talked to them. I've talked to these kids. I talk to these kids when they grow up with parents who are hyper in trying to fix the kid or care for the kid, and instead they do a lot of counterproductive stuff. And one of those things is passive-aggressive behavior or hyper-aggressive behavior trying to fix that kid, snap out of it and that kind of a thing. And there are parents that still do that. And it's scary to have a kid lose control. And I've never had kids, so I don't know what that's like. All I know is, from my perspective, even an expert who's studied professionally, academically, or whatever, about mental illness and mental illness in kids, they can't even handle mentally ill kids. And maybe if there are more portrayals, for instance, like, Sheldon's parents allow him to wear mittens when they say their prayers because he doesn't like to touch hands. A lot of Bible-based households would not allow their kids to do that. And so I think those are good examples of, even if you have a hyper-conservative ideology, you could still raise a hyper-intellectual kid who's special needs. And so that's another good example. Like I keep saying there, in this particular episode, I want to emphasize that when you see this stuff portrayed on the media, just be aware that most of these folks who suffer from mental illness suffer alone. And them being alone and them being ignored actually causes them to be more alone and more ignored. It doesn't work the opposite way. It should. And it's very hard to get positive attention when somebody is suffering. And another thing, too, is that trauma can lead to more trauma. Trauma leads to losing job, losing house, homelessness is a traumatic experience, and so on and so on. And so a lot of times what happens when somebody's alone and they're suffering, they just seem to lose their power, they lose their choices, and they keep going down and down and down on this social pecking order until they're institutionalized, they're incarcerated, or they're dead with self-harm or substance abuse. And that's the reality that I see. And so I think it would be funny if we had a whole TV show. Look at this, this person who suffers with mental illness, and you got another person who suffers with mental illness and who's talented and gifted. And they lived their whole life in obscurity, and nobody found out their stuff they were working on, and they died tragically. In the end, there was one story in particular where somebody found, it was some urban place like New York City or something like that, and there was this guy who really suffered alone and created this huge volume of this graphic novel, and it's just weird. And I can't remember the name of the documentary, but I remember this person was so in a different world that he thought that both men and women had penises. So he would draw these pictures of this place he was writing about, and everybody had penises because, I guess his childhood, he never saw a naked woman in his life. And so that's how isolated this guy was. And at the same time, he's writing this massive volume of novels. And nobody knew about it. And just imagine if nobody discovered that. I think his landlord found these handwritten things all over his apartment. And one of my sad thoughts, and I'm going to need another hot beverage for this. One of my sad thoughts is wondering how many of these people actually have something to contribute, and they are completely drowned out by the noise of so much media and so much content, especially these days of social media, and the importance we put on these numbers of this many hits and likes and comments and views and all this stuff. And we put a value on that. And it's that folks addicted to power who aren't necessarily naturally talented and gifted. They're hyper social functioning, they're hyper business functioning, and they're obsessed with power and influence. And that's the media that we're being fed most of the time, especially on the internet. And so it'd be really interesting if there was some way we could just completely fuck that process completely up and say, wouldn't that be weird to just I hate to say this though, but find a way into people's houses who are alone and who nobody wants to talk to and say, do you have any art or music or writing or videos or anything you do? Are you dancing? Just show me. And then just go to each one over and over and over and over again and pick out dozens of these and show those to the world and say, okay, let's just pretend that these have 1 million hits. And I think we'd find that we would have a lot of inspired content because a lot of the content right now that I see is incredibly derivative and really so conventional. And that's why we're having endless sequels and remakes and stuff like that, because I think social media is having that influence on us. And I think mentally ill people can access creative rooms and access creativity and sometimes skill because a lot of us have a lot of time on our hands that we can create stuff except for the fact that we're invisible. Most of us are invisible. Most of us are silenced. So we're not seen, we're not heard, and most of all, we're not understood. So it would be really weird if you could just drop an invisible bomb on the earth and suddenly all the content that was invisible, that nobody's seeing, will suddenly be shown.